This is Kick-Ass News. I'm Ben Mathis. Alan Zweibel started his comedy career selling jokes for $7 apiece to the last of the Borscht Belt stand-ups. Then one night, despite bombing on stage, he caught the attention of Lorne Michaels and became one of the first writers at Saturday Night Live, where he penned classic material for Gilda Radner, John Belushi, and all of the original SNL cast. From SNL, he went on to have a hand in a series of landmark shows, from its Garry Shandling's show to Curb Your Enthusiasm. Now, Alan Zweibel recalls his 4 decades in the business and traces the history of American comedy in his new memoir, Laugh Lines: My Life Helping Funny People Be Funnier. And today, Alan joins me on the show to talk about witnessing the decline of the Catskills in the 1970s, some of the old comedians who are still using the same material he wrote for them 40 years ago, and his very first manager, who served as the inspiration for Woody Allen's Broadway Danny Rose. He recalls his early attempts at performing stand-up, carpooling to comedy clubs every night with a young Billy Crystal, and being there for some of Larry David's legendary tantrums on stage. He shares memories from the first meeting of the original Saturday Night Live cast and writers, his special relationship with the late Gilda Radner, and some of his creative battles with the network censors at NBC. Alan discusses the genius of Garry Shandling, the delights and difficulties of working with him on the groundbreaking comedy It's Garry Shandling's Show, and what it's like to be in Larry David's world on Curb Your Enthusiasm. Plus, the comedian who wanted to pay him by the pound, the infamous night that Milton Berle hosted Saturday Night Live, and the charity auction that went horribly wrong, but then inspired Alan's next movie. Coming up with the very funny Alan Zweibel in just a moment. Alan Zweibel is an original Saturday Night Live writer who has won multiple Emmy and Writers Guild awards for his work in television. He also collaborated with Billy Crystal on the Tony Award-winning Broadway play 700 Sundays and won the Thurber Prize for American Humor for his novel The Other Schulman. Now he's out with a new memoir, Laugh Lines: My Life Helping Funny People Be Funnier. Alan Zweibel, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Well, Alan, I can't tell you how much I loved this book. You've got so many great stories. I mean, you've got a large chunk of the history of comedy in here, and so many of these great old stories of famous comedians would be lost if there weren't people like you putting them down for people to remember. In here, you say that you got your start writing jokes for an old Borscht Belt comic who mostly played the Catskills resorts. Now, a lot of people listening may not even realize that comics don't all write their own jokes. At least in the old days, that was the case. I don't know if that's still the case now, but, you know, Bob Hope famously employed a whole team of joke writers that he would keep up all night working. How did you get a gig as a joke writer?
Well, what happened was when I graduated college, I wanted to go to law school, but the law schools would have no part of me.
Really?
They saw my board scores and they said, no, this is stupid. So I always really wanted to become a comedy writer. I just didn't really know how to go about doing it. You know, there's no prescribed course. You know, if you go to dental school for 4 years, you come out, you're a dentist. You know, you do this.
Sure.
Where do you start? So after college, I moved back in with my parents, and my mom and dad went to, I guess it was Lake Tahoe, and they saw a singer named Engelbert Humperdinck, if you remember him.
Yeah, sure.
And on the bill, with his opening act was a Borscht Belt comedian named Morty Gunty. And my mother ran into him the next morning in a coffee shop, said that her son wants to be a writer. He gave her his name, phone number, and address, and I started writing for him. And as $7 a joke. That's what the going rate was at the time.
Really?
And in the Catskill Mountains in the early 70s, certainly way well before that as well, the 50s and 60s, you know, it was, it was the breeding grounds for new material, comics. That's where Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin and Toady Fields and Alan King and Red Buttons. They all started there and then went on to have their own television shows and Las Vegas acts. And by the time I got there in the early 70s, the Catskills, the hotels were starting to shut down. It just, it wasn't, the heyday was behind it. And the comedians that were playing there, the ones that I wrote for, were the also-rans. At this point, they weren't going to move on and get their own TV show, but they did have writers, and this man, Morty Gunty, who was so nice to me, I would go up to his home on a Friday afternoon, and I would write jokes for him, in front of him, have dinner with his family, and then I drive up to one of the hotels, like Grossinger's, or the Concord, the Nevele, that had these huge nightclubs, and sit in the back and see how my jokes worked. And when I'd be with him, he'd pull out his bottom drawer, and there were jokes that had been written for him years before by guys like Neil Simon and Larry Gelbart and Arnie Kogan. So it used to be a path to television comedy writing, because those guys eventually got TV shows, and they asked the writers to come along with them. But like I said, by the time I got there, that was no longer a viable path, But, I cut my teeth writing jokes for these guys, and I did it for a couple of years.
Yeah. Yeah. By the time you were writing for these guys, it was like, what, the 60s and 70s, and well past that heyday of the Catskills. In fact, I think that you refer to Morty Gunty or one of these comedians as sort of the Willy Loman of stand-up. And you were just like 20-something. So was there a certain pathos to witnessing all that?
Yeah, I graduated college in 72. The heyday of the Catskills were, a few preceding decades. And not only was it Morty, but it was also all those guys, a very nice, very, very good comedian named Freddie Roman, another man named Dick Capri. They would get in their cars and they would drive up to the mountains, to the Catskill resorts, tell their jokes, get back in the car and go home. And there was a blue collarish, they made very nice livings, but when I say blue collarish, there was a traveling salesman kind of aspect to it. The Willy Loman thing is not too far off, because they would travel, they would tell their jokes, hopefully get their laughs, get the check, and then go home. And they would do this many, many nights a week.
Yeah, and I think you say in here that some of these guys would pay you by the minute, or even there was one or two comics who wanted to pay you by the pound. What is a pound of jokes like?
Well, that was a term that was such a misnomer. First of all, it was $7 a joke, and then I graduated to if you wrote an individual joke was $7, okay? But if you wrote a routine for them, the starting rate was $100 a minute. Now that meant the delivered minute.
And these guys were pretty fast, right?
And these guys were incredibly fast. That's absolutely right, because they would just make a beeline from one punchline to the next. So I think I was losing money. Okay. Then I learned the expression "pound of jokes." I said, "What's that?" And they said, "Well, it's assorted jokes. Whatever you find is funny, just give me a pound of them." And I said, "Well, how much is in a pound?" And they said, about 16. Like each joke was an ounce. But I said, well, if I multiply 7 times 16, right?
Yeah.
That's more than $100 for the minute. Okay, I'm losing money.
Did it ever occur to you to use a thicker cardstock?
I should have used a thicker cardstock, a bigger font, a bigger something. And then they said, all right. I said, how about what about a dozen? Then it became a baker's dozen. I thought, geez, am I barking up the wrong tree here? But that's what the landscape was like at the time. These guys depended on writers, and writers wrote for them. Then when the 70s came along, probably the late 60s, early 70s, when comedy started to change, that's when David Steinberg and David Brenner and Robert Klein, they started, Lily Tomlin, they started hitting the clubs. They started coming along. And for the most part, they wrote their own material.
Right.
So these old guys, they still needed material, but they weren't on television anymore. So it's not like it was overexposed, So
Yeah.
a lot of them would do the same routine for 30, 40 years.
Yeah, I think you said that you would run into them decades later, and they'd still be telling some kind of Henry Kissinger joke that you wrote. Or
Yeah, and I would say to
yeah.
them afterwards, if you want to make it a little bit more topical, put in Madeleine Albright's name, just to freshen it just a bit, But these guys were dinosaurs,
Yeah.
and they showed up and they made an audience laugh, and they went on to their next gig. But the time left them by a little bit.
Can you give us some samples of the kind of jokes that you would write for them?
Oh God, I think the first joke that I ever got $7 for, I'd written a joke saying that there's a new thing now called sperm banks, which is just like an ordinary bank, except here after you make a deposit, you lose interest. Okay, that got me $7.
That's great.
Then there was another then the word started spreading around the Catskill Mountains that there's this young kid who writes great sperm bank jokes. So I became that guy. I became the sperm bank guy.
Really?
So there was another joke. What did I say? I said they were starting to freeze sperm. And I looked into the future and I said, this could be a problem because it's hard enough telling a kid he's been adopted. How do you tell him he's been defrosted? Okay. That was $7. It was a living hell, the whole
thing. Now, speaking of kind of the end of the Borscht Belt era and the decline of that certain period in comedy, you say in here that your first manager was actually the inspiration for Woody Allen's Broadway Danny Rose. What was he like?
Well, he was a very nice man his name was David Jonas, and he represented a handful of these Borscht Belt comedians. I mean, if I mentioned their names, Freddie Roman, Dick Capri, Billy Baxter, Vic Arnell, none of them, even then people didn't know their names. Okay. But he was an older man. I mean, at that time he was already in his mid to later 60s. Okay. Mm-hmm. And he had he spoke a mile a minute, and he had a toupee that I don't think he had enough glue because it would spin around in the wind. Okay. But he became my first manager. And when Broadway Danny Rose came out, I had read somewhere, because I knew that Woody Allen, for a brief moment in time, I don't know if he officially represented Woody Allen, but I know that they spent time together. When Broadway Danny Rose came out, I noticed the similarity. I asked people who went back to Woody Allen and said, well, he was one of the inspirations for it. He was that typical guy, okay, who had a stable of comedians and, very nice, very hardworking, but he only knew the Catskill Mountains. At one point, when Freddie Prinze came along, he noticed and he signed Freddie Prinze. Now, Freddie Prinze was really hot. He was 21 or 22 years old, where these other guys were already in their 50s. And he nurtured him. He nurtured Freddie Prinze. And when Freddie Prinze got a TV show called Chico and the Man, Freddie went out to California. And eventually Dave Jonas, he couldn't handle California. He was his comfort zone was the Catskill Mountains. And Freddie ended up leaving Dave. He was Dave was the king of the Catskills. His guys were the guys that were booked in all the rooms up there.
And you eventually started going on stage yourself, but you admit in here that you really never had a desire to be a stand-up. You always wanted to be the funny guy behind the guy. So what was your thinking when you started performing?
Well, look, I appreciate the compliment, but the word performing is an incredible misnomer.
Oh, yeah.
When I realized that the Catskills were a dead end, and I saw that there were two clubs in the early and the mid 70s in New York, one called The Improvisation, the other called Catch a Rising Star. And that's where Elaine Boozler and, like I said earlier, Robert Klein and my friend Larry David, they were coming through these clubs. Okay. And these guys were my age. They were talking about the things which were my life experience. All right. And So the plan was to take the jokes that these older men wouldn't buy from me because they said it was too hip for their audiences. And the plan was to go on stage, tell the jokes with the hopes that a manager or an agent, somebody would like the material and want to represent me to become a TV comedy writer, which is what I wanted to do. So I never cared about the performance aspect of it. These days, yeah, I do speaking engagements all over the country. I go on late night talk shows. I'm okay at it. I'm a storyteller and I know how to handle myself. But back then, I was petrified, and I would just tell the jokes. And if they liked the jokes, they laughed. And if the audience didn't like the jokes, there was no sense of performance where I was able to get any laughs out of them.
Oh, yeah.
But like I said, it was a means to an end.
Yeah. What was your act like? I mean, did you have a particular style?
Well, it's style. Once again, you give me credit that's so undeserved.
Okay.
Style means you know what you're talking about, and you go, "All right, I'm going to be that guy."
Yeah.
My perspective was real. My perspective was I was indeed a younger generation than Alan King and some of the people that were my parents' age.
Yeah,
All
the
right.
old
So
tuxedo
we were the next
comics.
generation.
Yeah.
We were the Woodstock generation. We are the ones who were affected by the Vietnam War. So my perspective was pretty much about being the son of these middle class parents.
So, who were some of the other comics that you came up with? You mentioned Larry David.
Larry David, Billy Crystal, Richard Lewis. David Brenner had already passed through these places, but he would come back and he would work on material for his next, let's say, Tonight Show shot. Same thing with Robert Klein. I said Elaine Boozler. Who else? Seinfeld came later. You see,
Right. That
Seinfeld
was the
came
80s,
later. So
right?
I missed Jerry by a couple of years. I had already gone on to do SNL, and that's
Mhm.
when he started hitting the clubs. I'm a few years older than him.
Now, I've always heard stories of Larry's old act, how he would get annoyed at the audience and just walk off stage, or worse, sometimes he would get in an argument with the audience. Were you ever witness to some of that?
Well, look, when back then the acts was spaced like 20 minutes apart.
Hmm.
So okay, so like 9 o'clock, 9:20, 9:40, like that. But if I was to follow Larry, I would get there the same time Larry did because when he got on stage, if he didn't like the audience or if they didn't feel right to him or they didn't laugh at a couple of his first jokes, he would look at them, just wave his hand and go, I can't do this and walk off the stage. And I'd get on at 9:01,
And you mentioned that Billy Crystal was one of the people you came up with. In fact, I guess you said that you would ride to clubs together and then listen to your tapes on the way back. Was he pretty much fully formed as a comedian back then, or were you still witnessing the evolution of his act?
A little bit of both,
Hmm.
because prior to me meeting Billy, he was a member of a trio, of a comedy trio.
Oh, I didn't know
And
that.
he,
Huh.
yeah, and he had, it was either Three's Company or Three's a Crowd, something with three in it. Okay, seriously, it's in the book. I forgot what it was. And he had just become a single performer fairly recently. And I lived with my parents. I don't know if you know the geography of Long Island, in Woodmere, Long Island, on the
Okay.
South Shore. And about four towns over was Long Beach, Long Island, where Billy lived with his wife, Janice, and they already had a little girl, Jenny. And Billy and I became friends. And he would pick me up every night in his little blue Volkswagen. We'd drive into the city. We'd do our individual acts, right? And then he would drive me home. We would listen to the cassettes in the car and critique each other. A new material, or what if you said it this way, or how word it like that. And that's how we started together. And this was 1970, I want to say four.
Now you got a big break when you got hired as one of the original writers on Saturday Night Live. How did you first meet Lorne Michaels, and what was that first interview like?
I had come off the stage one night. It was about 1 in the morning, and I was having trouble making these six drunks from Des Moines laugh. And about 4 months into this experiment of mine of, delivering my jokes on stage, and I went to the bar and was waiting for Billy so he can drive me home. And this young man came up next to me, sat down, uh, found it necessary to tell me that I was one of the worst comedians he'd ever seen in his life, but that he liked my material. And it was Lorne. And I had this Dave Jonas was my manager, and there was a very nice man who was an agent at William Morris. His name was Lorne Michaels, and they submitted me to Lorne to interview for to be a writer on this brand new show. So I took all the jokes that I had that I had ever written, basically 1,100 of them, and I put them into a binder, and I brought it into the city for my interview with Lorne, and I gave him the binder, and he looked at the first joke and just nodded and went, really good, and then closed the binder. I was up for 2 days straight typing 1,100 jokes, and if you remember back then, the typewriters had ribbons with ink,
right.
and it was a mess.
Yeah.
Okay, and he read one joke, and he kept the binder. Obviously, he went through it and showed it to the NBC executives and whatever. But that was my interview. I got a call, I would say 2-3 days later, from that man Lorne Michaels, who called Dave Jonas, who called me and said, you got a job on this new show. And it was magical. It was, yeah. I was 24, and I was going to be a TV writer.
Now, what was it like, that first assembly of the original cast and writers from SNL?
Well, I went up there the first day, and there was a meeting in Lorne's office of the writers and the actors. And I looked around that room, and I had never seen anything like this before, because there was John Belushi, and there was Gilda, and there was Lorraine Newman and Dan Aykroyd. It was a different kind of comedy than what I was used to. I was a joke writer. These guys were improv players. They were doing things in the room that made each other laugh. I had never heard of Second City at that point. Okay, so they were bringing that kind of energy to things that they were acting out on the cuff. And, and look around the writer's room, there was Michael O'Donoghue, who had founded the National Lampoon. Ann Beats wrote for the National Lampoon. Al Franken and Tom Davis, they were a comedy team from L.A. It was, Lorne said this is going to be a variety show, but he further explained it by saying that means it's going to be a variety of different kinds of comedy. And the sensibilities that were in that room were very different from each other. Some was darker, some was sillier, and whatever. And it came from different angles. But God, it worked.
And everyone from those early days on SNL seems to have their own opinion about when, during that first season, the show really hit its stride. What episode do you think was the turning point for SNL?
Well, there was a show that we did, the 10th show that we did, that we won a bunch of Emmys for. You submit a show, and that's the one that's voted on, right? It was one that Elliot Gould hosted. The 11th show is one that I wrote Samurai Delicatessen for. It was Buck Henry hosted it. I think, when I asked people, I interviewed a lot of my old SNL cronies, about, and I asked them that question that you just asked me. Some thought it was Lily Tomlin, which was the 6th show, because the women writers had a louder voice in that one. It varies as you look back at it, but we knew it was different from the get-go. It was like, as a little boy, I used to watch TV variety shows, comedy variety shows, and I couldn't understand why I heard laughter coming through the television. Who would laugh at this crap? Okay, well, who are these people, And here, I felt that we were genuinely funny, and the laughs we were getting from the audience, and the fact that Chevy, busted out first, and then it became what they called, like the water cooler kind of show, where on Monday they would quote jokes from Weekend Update, or to see what they did. And very early on, Gilda and I also did a couple with Belushi, would do college speeches.
Oh, really?
And you got to understand, this was a show that was tucked in the corner, 11:30 to 1 on Saturday nights. And people, kids would fill up an auditorium, of course, to see Belushi, not me. But I would get an applause if I told them that I wrote Rosanna Dana. It was, writers were never afforded this kind of recognition. But the show, it snowballed and it became a cult hit, and then it grew into a phenomenon. It's
Yeah.
on 45 years
Oh,
now, for
yeah.
God's sake.
We're going to take a quick break, and then I'll be back with more when we come back in just a minute. This ad is a warning. Our democracy is under attack from the U.S. Supreme Court. In the middle of a deadly global pandemic, people across Wisconsin were planning on voting absentee to keep themselves and their families safe. But the night before the election, 5 Republican justices on the Supreme Court told thousands of people they would have to choose between risking their lives and forfeiting their right to vote. This Supreme Court favoring Republican interests over our democracy is nothing new. They gutted the Voting Rights Act. They invited billionaires and corporations to spend unlimited amounts trying to influence elections. They gave a green light to gerrymandering, voter ID laws, and voter roll purges. Now, a progressive movement is rising up to fight back. Because it's quite possible the Wisconsin case won't be the last 2020 showdown over voting rights to be settled in the courts. And we simply can't trust this court to put aside partisan views and protect people's right to vote. Our courts are becoming too political. It's time to say enough. Learn more about how you can join the fight by visiting demandjustice.org/kick. That's demandjustice.org/kick. We were just talking about how all the people on SNL have their own take on when that turning point was for the show, but I don't think anyone disagrees on what the worst episode was. There's this episode where Milton Berle hosted, and it's sort of the stuff of legends because it was so bad that Lorne Michaels has never allowed it to air again. What went wrong there?
Everything.
Okay.
I can't even be. Look, on paper, I guess you could say it sort of made sense. There was a symmetry to it because he was on that network. And when he had the Texaco Hour, it was the hot show on television, and it was NBC, and it was a phenomenon. And here he came back so many years later, and we were basically that a newer version, okay, in terms of popularity and whatever. But he was so old school. He would break character in the middle of a sketch and look at the camera and just start doing jokes. Wait a second. You're supposed to be in a sketch talking to this other person. You're playing a camera, and even in his monologue, I remember when they were camera blocking it, he at one point, you got to understand, listen to what I'm saying now. We were camera blocking, which means we were rehearsing in front of a camera what his opening monologue would be. And he was talking to camera, doing whatever jokes, which are old-fashioned jokes, but okay, that's who he was. But at one point, he said to the director, "Now, Dave, when I say that line, wait a beat, and then I need a sound effect of as if a crowbar fell from the ceiling, landed on the studio floor, and sort of like wobbled, reverberating."
Yeah.
And Dave said, "Why?" He said, "Well, because at that point, I am going to ad lib." Oh, it sounds like NBC dropped another one. Now listen to that phrase. At that point, I am going to ad lib.
Right.
You planted in a thing to ad lib. Here was the show with the greatest comedy minds, the greatest improvisational players on earth. And this guy is coming along, planting a thing for him to react to as if it's going to be an ad lib. Oh, it was a nightmare.
Yeah, it sounds like he was just everything that Saturday Night Live wasn't.
Well, he was antithetical to, he was everything we were playing against.
Yeah.
Everything we were rebelling against.
And you saw Milton's famous appendage, didn't you?
He thought it was necessary. I went into his dressing room. Before SNL, I had written for a lot of roasts from the Friars Club. And they back in those days, there was stag luncheons. And, when you would write for one of those roasts, there were 1,300 people in a ballroom at the Hilton or wherever it was held. And you would write about somebody's stereotype. Okay, so when it came to Milton, there were two stereotypes: one that he stole jokes,
Right.
the other one was the size of his differential.
Yeah.
And yeah, when I was on the show, I was in his dressing room, and I said, Milton, and I just meant this as an icebreaker. It wasn't a request whatsoever. I said, it's so weird that I'm meeting you. I said, because for years I wrote jokes about, he used to write jokes like, his dick is so big that after a circumcision, they used the foreskin to cover the infield at Yankee Stadium. Okay. All those fucking jokes. So I said, here I am. And you don't understand. He was wearing a bathrobe, one of those short ones that come about mid-thigh.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting on a couch, and there's a coffee table between us, and he's facing me. He's standing, looking at the couch. And I go, I'm meeting you now. And he says, you mean you've never seen it? I go, what? He said, would you like to see it? And I was somewhere between the N and the O in no. When he took out this anaconda, and it goes, pretty amazing, huh? I go, yeah, it's really amazing. And by the way, anybody who doubted that story because it's so outrageous, they come back and they go, anybody we spoke to, Milton would show it to anyone.
Yes. Yes.
That was his. Not only was he big, but he would offer to show. It was my turn, I guess. I guess he got to the Z's in the alphabet.
Well, I'll tell you, I used to be a member. I was probably the youngest member of the Beverly Hills Friars Club when I was a kid. I was probably like 23 or something. And they were just so desperate for members, they would basically give you a free membership if you were a young kid. And I remember one time, anyone was invited to sit at his table at lunch, and everyone kind of gradually peeled off. It was probably 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And this was toward the end. He walked with a cane and all that. He was like, I need to go to the restroom. Could you help me to the restroom? Because I was the only person left there. So I did it. And then I get there, and we get up to the urinals, and he whips it out. And the stories were definitely true. And then he zips up, washes his hands, and then he just walks out on his own. And
that's hilarious.
Jeff Ross has the exact same story from same thing, Beverly Hills Friars Club, end of lunch, no one's around, and he asks him to walk into the bathroom.
Because he wanted somebody to see it,
yeah.
Right? I joined the New York Friars Club officially in 82, 3, but I had been going there years before because those Catskill guys would take me there. They all belonged. And they not only spoke about the size of Milton's dick, but there was a comic, I can't remember if it was Dick Shawn or David Brenner, walked in on Milton. Milton was in the steam room, and he was naked. And let's say it was Dick Shawn. Dick Shawn walked in, saw Milton's penis for the first time, and thought Milton was there with his son.
One thing that comes across in here, it's interesting, is how sort of by the seat of your pants SNL was in those days. How, everything was still forming up till the very last minute. I think several times you talk about even when they were doing Weekend Update, you would be under the desk handing up cue cards with jokes, right?
Well, there were index cards. They were the show in particular. There was a live show that we did from the Mardi Gras. And there was a parade that was supposed to take place. I think it's called the Bacchus Parade.
Oh, yeah.
And we had a list of all of the floats and all the things that would come by the reviewing stand where Jane Curtin and Buck Henry were. And we had jokes about every single one of these things because we were told beforehand. There was an incident that happened at the beginning of the parade that we didn't know about. Okay, I don't know if somebody died. To this day, I can't remember exactly what it was. So I was under the desk, and every time they cut to Buck and Jane on the reviewing stand, they had jokes about a parade that wasn't there. So I was under the desk writing jokes and handing it up to them to try to fill the time. It was really exciting.
And you had a very special relationship with Gilda, first professionally and then even personally. When you two were working together on ideas for SNL, what was your process like?
Well, the process was that she'd come in and she'd tell me that what she wanted to do. She wanted to be a parakeet. She wanted to be she wanted to play a little girl doing a soup commercial, whatever it was. Emily Litella was a character that I had a hand in, although other writers did as well. Gilda played a little old lady who went on Weekend Update, and it was sort of hard of hearing. So she would give an editorial reply to an editorial that she misheard. So she would rant on and on
Yeah.
about saving Soviet jewelry, and presidential erections and stuff like that. But what Gilda and I wrote mostly in restaurants.
Uh-huh.
And whatever it was, I would interview her, not an interview. I would go, "How about?" or "What would you say if?" And I just write it down on legal pads. And then after dinner, she would go somewhere. I don't know. She'd have a date. She'd go to Studio 54. I'd go back to the office, and I try to make sense of whatever we spoke about at dinner.
And it's easy to lose sight of just how edgy and subversive that show was in those early days. And I think some of the best stories in this book are actually of your battles with the network censors. Do you have a favorite one?
Well, look, you have to put it in the context of time. There was no cable. There
Hmm.
was certainly no streaming. There wasn't even Fox. Fox didn't come along till later on after I had co-created its Garry Shandling show.
Right.
Okay, so Fox came along in the late '80s. So CBS, NBC, ABC, that was television. So I remember there was a censor, there was a number of censors. A man named Jay Otley was a very nice man. Another man named Bill Clotworthy, also very nice, because they worked with you and they got the joke and they try to help you figure out, look, I can't go to my boss and say that. Can you say it this way? And we would go
Hmm.
back and forth like that, right? But there was a woman named Jane Crowley who had no sense of humor, big woman, ex-nun or something like that. I dress shields, and she was like Margaret Dumont's character in the Marx
Yeah.
Brothers movies.
Yeah.
No sense of humor. And Michael O'Donoghue called me up once. I was producing the Weekend Update segment, and he said, "Listen, why don't we have Weekend Update brought to you by a product that we make up?" I said, "Sure, let's go for it." So for this particular week's show, he had Don Pardo say, "And now Weekend Update brought to you by Pussy Whip, the dessert topping for cats." And it worked great.
Yeah.
It worked so great that I wanted to do one. So the next week at the dress rehearsal, right, a full audience and the whole thing earlier in the evening at dress rehearsal, I had Pardo say, "And now Weekend Update brought to you by Blue Balls, BLEU, Blue Balls, the cheese snack from France." Okay. And it worked really good. Okay. Well, everyone said, "Let's put it on." One person had a problem with it. This is Jane Crowley, the daughter of the control room opened. And you got to understand, during dress rehearsal is when the censor would sit there with the script in front of them, and it was their last chance actually to censor us, because you go on the air live later and it's out there, right? So she found me and she says, "Alan, you can't do that on the air show." I said, "Can't do what?" She says, "You can't say blue balls." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because it has to do with the male genitalia." And I said, "Jane, last week you let us say pussy whip, which is clearly the female genitalia. But now this week, what kind of sexist organization are you running here?" And she said, "Give me a second." She goes back into the control room, picks up a phone, calls God, I guess, comes back about 10 minutes later. She finds me, goes, "Alan, I discussed it and I gave it a lot of thought. And I've come to the conclusion that because I gave you a pussy whip last week, I'll be more than happy to give you blue balls this week." I said, Jane, that's not really necessary. Just let us say it on TV and we'll call it even. You know?
I love it. And that those kind of things have really become part of the fabric of Saturday Night Live. You've come from that to what was it? The old Christopher Walken sketch, Colonel Angus, and all. That's really become a part of the show.
Colonel Angus, and they had. This was way after. Didn't they have sweaty balls?
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah.
All that stuff. No, it's great. It's great.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that later you worked on It's Garry Shandling's show. You co-created that show with Garry.
I co-created it with with Garry. Yeah.
Tell us about how the two of you teamed up on that.
I had left SNL, and I didn't have an office, at 30 Rock anymore. And we started Robin's my wife, we started having children, and I needed a place to work. So I joined the Friars Club. They had a room upstairs that had a big screen TV and a couch and a newspaper rack, and I used it as an office. And one day during lunch, I got a phone call from a man named Bernie Brillstein, who was my manager.
Oh, yeah.
He signed me when I was still with SNL. He managed Lorne and Belushi and Aykroyd and Gilda, and he was now my manager. And he asked me if I knew who Garry Shandling was. And I said, yeah, I've seen him on Letterman. He's really funny. And Bernie was this big, gruff man, heavy set, white beard, white. If Kenny Rogers and Santa Claus had a kid, it would be Bernie. Okay.
Yeah.
And I go, what about Shandling? He says, well, he's doing a special, which for Showtime, that's going to go straight into the shit house, unless they get some, clear eyes, to punch up the script. So that they sent me the script. I really liked it. They flew me out to LA. I went straight from the airport to whatever restaurant to meet Garry. And I met Garry, and all during dinner, he was wearing sunglasses. And I couldn't get a read whether the guy liked me, liked my ideas. I just couldn't read it,
Yeah.
And we left each other, and I figured, and he said, okay, let's be in touch. And we go, I check into whatever hotel, I fall asleep. At 1:00 in the morning, the phone in the hotel room rings. Now you gotta understand, it's 4:00 in the morning for my body. I had just flown out from New York, and I pick it up. I go, hello, Alan, it's Garry. Hey man, what's doing? Alan, my dog's penis tastes bitter. You think it's his diet or what? I called my wife. I said, I think I found a writing partner. he pound for pound, possibly the funniest person I ever met. I mean, I've got very, very funny friends, very, very funny friends. Garry was funny as a character. You know what I'm saying? As a character in the world. And God, did he make me laugh. And we got along. Well, at first we got along really well, and we created this show, and it became a hit. It was on Showtime, and we wrote the theme song together in an elevator. And, it just clicked. And for me, it was like lightning striking a second time.
But it also sounds like with him, it could be pretty trying. And maybe you kind of never knew what side of him you were going to get when you came in, huh?
Well, look, you were writing, once again, it was writing with somebody for that person.
Right.
Okay. And if Garry didn't want to say something, he didn't say it. Or if you talked him into saying it, it would be delivered in a way that was so unauthentic that it wasn't worth winning that battle. And yeah, he was a great writer, and he played himself. He played Garry Shandling, the comedian, and we had a great writing staff. But Garry was he had a vision of what he wanted things to be. So those weeks that it was at odds with either me or what the writing staff wanted to do, those became very, very long nights, having to implement his notes and trying to figure out what he wanted.
Yeah, you talk about what a perfectionist he was and how he would always keep working on that script and hammering away at it until the last minute, pretty much.
Well, something, I ran that show not dissimilarly to the way Saturday Night Live is. Until you say it, until you do it, it's subject to being honed,
Hmm.
and so we would have a dress rehearsal, and then we would tweak the script between the dress rehearsal and the actual taping of the show. And then you take both those shows and you can blend them together, if you want. But it was always, and I would um, I would be in front of my bank of monitors. I was producing the show while Garry was on stage performing and doing the show in front of the studio audience. And if a joke, even if a joke worked, sometimes he would stop tape between scenes, call me in. He goes, "Do we have another joke for that?" I said, "If the joke just worked, it worked great. Let's move on. Do we have another joke?" And I would give him a joke that either I thought of in the moment or one that we had had earlier in the week that he forgot about. And he thought it was a new joke and he would use it. So there was sort of tricks that we did so we can get home that night.
Yeah. And I look back at that show. God, I mean, it was so ahead of his time, so groundbreaking with the breaking of the fourth wall and the stuff with the booth, the celebrity neighbors, how they would drop by so matter of fact. I mean, that was a
Rob Reiner would
groundbreaking
come
show.
by to do the dishes, and Tom Petty would stop by to return Gary's hedge
Yeah.
clippers. It was a lot of fun. Yeah.
And you've also served as a consulting producer on my favorite show, Curb Your Enthusiasm. What does a consulting producer on a show like that do?
Well, I can tell you what I did as a consulting
Okay.
producer. What I did basically was listen to what Larry's ideas were.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Okay.
I went, wow, that's really good. Okay. Larry and I shared offices. He had, it's all Larry. It's all Larry.
Yeah.
He gets these ideas, and there's no script really. And what it is a pretty detailed outline, and the actors get to the set or the stage and say whatever you want, but hit these bullet points because that's our story.
Hmm.
And you do it over and
Right.
over and over again, and then you edit it, in the editing room to give it the coherence that you want. I was an actor on it one episode,
Right.
and all Larry did when he called me up, he said, "Listen, this is what the deal is. I'm shooting in New York. You're in New York. You see me in a Japanese restaurant. You say, 'Hey, why don't we have lunch?'" He said that he's going to say, "Why should we have lunch?" I'm going to say, "Because we never have it in LA where we live." He says, "Well, then why should I have it with you here? Do you ever think I don't have it in LA with you because I don't like you?" And we just went off on it. And we must have shot it 5, 6 times for about a half hour worth of footage. And ultimately, it was like a 2.5 minute scene. It was like every phone conversation I've had with Larry since also 1974
Really?
when I first met him.
How much of the Larry David that we see on Curb is the real Larry David?
It's an exaggerated version.
Hmm.
Larry David, who's my friend, yeah, he's incredibly funny, incredibly smart, but he's incredibly generous and he's kind and yeah, he's naughty. Yeah, you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
he doesn't in his personal life, nothing that I've witnessed where he goes to the extremes that Larry on television does. He is you know we all harbor certain thoughts and go, "Gee, what if?" And Larry's
Yeah.
just not afraid to mention
Yeah. Yeah.
mention it. Where other people, where most civil people go, "Ooh, you don't say that." You whisper that. When Larry makes a whole episode about it.
Yeah, yeah. I always recognize myself in his show. And I think that's the appeal. I think everyone thinks that they have some kind of a personal relationship with Larry or that they're exactly alike in some weird
Oh
ways.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and you have these women go, "Oh, my husband is just like him, or my father." Yeah, okay, I get it, I get it. So, but
Yeah.
yeah, he's a genius, and he touches a nerve where something is relatable. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? He does it his own way, but there's no real. It's all based on elements of truth.
You also collaborated with your old pal Billy Crystal on his fantastic one-man play a few years ago, 700 Sundays. I loved that. And it was a very
Oh,
personal
thank you.
play. Yeah, he opens up about his family, his relationship with his father, etc. Having grown up in a Jewish family in Brooklyn, was that world that he portrayed in that show pretty familiar to you?
Well, I was born in Brooklyn. I grew up on Long Island.
Okay, right,
Okay.
right. Sorry.
Uh, and like I said earlier, I we lived in Woodmere. He lived in Long Beach. They were 4 or 5 towns over. And even though he populated his play, 700 Sundays, with his family and extended family. I had never met most of them. I knew his brothers, but I didn't meet his parents. I certainly didn't meet the aunts and uncles and other people who populated his home. But, being a fellow Jew on Long Island, it's not like I was running from Martians. I can relate to these
Hmm.
people. So I would write for my own extended family in a sense because they were relatable to me. And if Billy liked the joke or the dialogue or whatever we were doing, he would put it into the mouths of his in those vignettes that he was doing about his family.
Yeah, and it's a real testament to your friendship and your talent that you were able to work with him on something so personal like
Well, I
that.
was honored.
Right.
I was honored that he trusted me with
Yeah.
these characters who were so dear to him.
Wow.
So I think it was, and we at that point we were friends. Oh, maybe 25ish years and had never worked with each other. But the fact that he chose me to help him with this, that was so profoundly personal and meant so much. It may be like the biggest honor that anybody's ever given me professionally when it comes to
Yeah.
something like that.
And I understand that you're working with Billy again on a movie now. Is it true that this is an idea that came from something that actually happened to you?
We shot the movie and it's edited, and we're very, very lucky that,
Great.
given what's going on outside in the world,
Oh, yeah.
that we finished shooting it in November. So Billy has already edited it. It stars. It's a movie called Here Today. It stars Billy and Tiffany Haddish, and yeah, its genesis was a. I had been a guest on the Letterman show. One of the appearances, I told a true story. Uh, Somebody had won me uh, in an auction to have lunch with me. It was a fundraiser for like a local theater or something like that. And I live in New Jersey, and uh, the lunch was going to be in New York. So I drove in, I paid tolls, I parked the car, and I go in and I meet this young woman who won me. Okay, now you understand, my friends, when they're put up for auction, like Larry, somebody will pay $100,000 to watch him brush his teeth. Or Tom Hanks will pay $500,000 to watch him change his shirt. And
Yeah.
so I go in and I meet this young woman, and we're in a restaurant, and I ordered food, and she ordered a huge seafood salad, I remember. And we got to talking, and I said, "Listen, I don't want to be indelicate, but how much money did you spend, to have this lunch?" And she said 22. And I go, "Wow, $2,200. It's not Larry David money, but
Yeah.
man, that's a," yeah, she goes, 2,200. No, it's $22. I said, "You wait a second, you $22 was the winning bid to have lunch with me?" And she said, "Well, the bidding started at $20 and went up in 50-cent increments." I went, God. So now I hate her. Okay. And we're talking, and as we're eating, I see that her right ear is turning red and her lip starts to droop. And this eye is about now 3 times the size of the other eye. And she was having an allergic reaction to the seafood. Okay. And I'm sitting there wondering,
Oh, God.
at what point does my obligation to this contest winner,
Right.
okay, end? Well, it ended up, I'm a nice guy. Uh, I accompanied her to Lenox Hill Hospital. She didn't have insurance. I bought her an EpiPen. Okay. All right. I went upstairs to her bed, her apartment. I injected her the way the guy at the thing told me. And what cost her 22 cost me, about 1,100. All right. I told this story as a guest one night on the Letterman show. Billy called me or texted me while he was watching it. We spoke the next day. He said, "Why don't we have that as the first scene between a man and a woman, like a May December relationship, and let's see where it goes." So I said, "Fine." And it took us 3 years to write this script. And back cross country. I was in New York. He was in L.A. And yeah, when he came to New York, we worked together. I went to L.A. We worked together. But so much of it was done writing scenes and emailing it to each other and editing and doing whatever. And ultimately, we got Tiffany Haddish. Billy had this wonderful idea. Why not cast Tiffany Haddish as the young woman? And here we are. We started shooting. I guess it was the end of September. It ended in November sometime. So we were very lucky. The picture is great. We locked the picture. I think there's still some post-production work that has to be done on it. But I mean, look at how many movies had to shut down.
I know.
This sort of happened. So we're very fortunate.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that is a fantastic premise right there. Well, I can't wait to see that. And this book was just so terrific, Alan. I loved it. And you got so many great stories, and you do interviews with a lot of these comics and writers that you've known for so many years, and it's packed with jokes that you've written throughout the years. Before we go, can you take us out with just one more joke?
Yeah, I can tell you the joke that that was at the top of the list of the 1,100 of the ones that I gave Lorne. Okay. Show you how long ago it was from the reference points in the joke. I had said that the post office was about to issue a stamp commemorating prostitution in the United States. It's a 10-cent stamp. You want to lick it, it's a quarter. Okay. So, I wrote that joke in 1975 because the following year was the bicentennial, and they were starting to issue stamps commemorating different aspects of United States history. So I wrote it back then, and now if I go to a college and I tell my story and I tell that joke, 17, 18, 19-year-old kids are going, why would you want to lick a stamp? It's already sticky on the back. So, so I'm glad you're old enough to
right.
remember that we licked stamps.
Right. You don't want to be the old tuxedo comic telling Henry Kissinger jokes.
I'm that guy. I turn into Morty Gunty. Yeah. How'd that happen?
Well, I just love this book. I can't recommend it to folks highly enough. The book is called Laugh Lines, My Life Helping Funny People Be Funnier. Alan Zweibel, this was such a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again to Alan Zweibel for coming on the podcast. Order Laugh Lines, My Life Helping Funny People Be Funnier on Amazon, Audible, or wherever books are sold. Follow him on Twitter at Alan Zweibel or at alansweibel.com, and look for his new movie, Here Today, starring Billy Crystal and Tiffany Haddish, coming out this fall. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and rate and review us while you're there. 5-star ratings and detailed reviews are one of the best ways for new listeners to discover the show. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at @KickassNewsPod and recommend us to your friends on your social media. For more fun stuff, visit kickassnews.com, and I welcome your comments, questions, and suggestions at comments@kickassnews.com. For now, I'm Ben Mathis, and thanks for listening to Kick-Ass News.